Singer Annie Lennox was born in Aberdeen on Christmas Day, 1954, her parents' only child. She left Aberdeen for London at 17.
Sweet dreams are made of these. Who am I to...
In the early 1980s, she shot to global fame as one half of the band Eurythmics.
Everybody's looking for something.
Today, as well as having a successful solo career, she is an active campaigner on humanitarian issues.
People ask me, like, what was your background? I will always say, well, really, it's working class. From what I know of my family, nobody came from money. You know, nobody had a silver spoon. It was hard work, and they believed in doing the right thing, So for this, I have tremendous respect. Although my own life is turned out to be very different, completely different. My values are in there, though. I knew my grandparents very well. As for the generation or two or whoever before, I know nothing about them. So we're going to really, this is what we're going to find out. Maybe not. It's really, it's very tantalizing, the whole thing. Obviously, I don't know what I'm about to discover, whether it's going to be something extraordinary or something disappointing. But for me now, it's like, I'll take the risk. I won't say, no, I don't want to know anything about that. I'm like, yeah, I want to go on an adventure.
To start her journey, Annie is heading back to Aberdeen in northeast Scotland.
Aberdeen is where I was born, and it's where I grew up, and it's where my grandparents lived. So it is a good starting point.
First, Annie wants to look into her late father's side of the family. Her father's mother, Annie's grandmother, Jean Lennox, lived into her late 90s, and Annie knew her very well, but she knows nothing about her grandmother's background.
This morning, I'm going to visit my Auntie Jean. And Auntie Jean is my father's sister, my grandmother's youngest daughter, only daughter, actually. It would be really nice to sit down with Jean and take the time to talk about my grandmother and her side of the family. She's got to be able to fill in the dots for me, so we'll find out. It'll be really interesting. Hello.
Oh, this is a surprise. Gee, in you come.
All right.
Anne, do you remember that evening? A busload came down from Aberdeen and there was a proud grandma.
That's so sweet, though.
And then, of course, at the end of the concert, we all got onto the bus and came back and we had a wee sing-song.
You had a wee sing-song?
We had a wee sing-song.
Oh, that's nice.
Yes. And, of course, there's the wedding
There's the
photograph.
wedding photograph. Grandma was 18, she was quite young when they were married, right? Mm-hmm. I would very much like to know more about her background, about her mother and father. I don't know anything about them.
Well, there is a picture.
Oh, gosh.
I'm hoping that we're going to find out a little bit about, well, my grandfather, Henderson, and the rest of his family.
I have never seen this picture before. I've never...
No.
So this is Grandma's father.
That's right. Now, when I asked Mum about him, she said she was only about 3 or so when he died.
Yeah.
And she really couldn't say anything about him at all. So, we know nothing about
That side of the family.
that
This is
side.
the Henderson side.
This is the Hendersons.
The Hendersons,
yes.
okay. God,
Glad
how
it's that
strange.
way. But maybe you will discover something.
Yeah, who knows?
That
Who
would
knows?
be, that
The
would
mystery.
be good, wouldn't it?
Fascinating.
Annie's grandmother Jean was only 3 when her father, Charles Henderson, died. So nothing is known about his branch of the family. To see what she can discover, Annie has come to Aberdeen's Central Library. She's being helped by librarian David Main.
So he was born in 1866.
Okay, so one of the first things that we can try and do is to have a look for his birth certificate.
Right, oh, okay.
Okay.
Let's do it then.
So if we have a look for Henderson, on this one we've got a birth record for 1866, Charles Fraser Henderson, and it's in the parish of Aberdeen, so we know that we've got the right one. And what's useful about the birth record is it gives us details of his parents. So we have father's name is James Henderson, and he's a stoker on a steam vessel. And we've got Jessie Henderson, maiden name is Fraser.
So my great-great-grandparents were James Henderson and Jessie Henderson, but her maiden name was Fraser.
That's absolutely right, yeah.
Now Annie has the names of her great-great-grandparents. She should be able to discover more about them.
We can now hopefully look on the census records to find them as a family living in Aberdeen. So if we look for the 1871 census, we'll include Jessie's name and just zoom in and we'll go through
Wow.
in a bit more detail.
James Henderson.
That's right.
He's the head of the family. And there's Jessie. There's Jessie, his
That's
wife.
right.
Yeah, yeah. And she's 24. Ah, what's this bit here?
So this is showing us where they were born.
Where they were born.
So this line here is for James. So we've got him being born in...
Aberdeenshire. And she's born
Jessie.
in Banff, Banffshire. Okay.
Do you know Banff at all?
Ish. I know it's kind of north somewhere.
Certainly is north.
Well, she's a country lass.
Indeed.
Is there any way we can find out a little bit more about her?
Well, we can try and find out more about her background. That might give us some indication as to
Why
maybe
she came to Aberdeen, right, right.
maybe why she moved, yeah.
Yeah.
We can have a look on the 1851 census at Jessie Fraser, but as a little girl this time. And we're looking specifically at Banff because we know that that's where she's from. But unfortunately, no matches.
Oh.
So Jessie being a bit of a pet name, it's possible that she had a different birth name, and that's why we're not finding her.
So what is the original name from Jessie? What
The most common name would be Janet.
Janet. Oh, okay.
So
let's try it.
We'll give that a whirl.
Okay. This is real detective work. Okay.
Fingers crossed this time.
Ah, so it's 1851. Janet Fraser, 3 years old.
Have a detailed look at it.
There she is.
We have Janet, which is Jessie, and the rest of her family are all
All
displayed
there.
there. So
Yeah. We've got Mary Fraser, Jessie's mother. Oh, Mary is the head of the family. So there's no. Where's the father?
this note here says she's a widow, formerly
Formerly.
horseshoer's wife. So her husband would have been a blacksmith.
So he must have died and left her taking care of all these children.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
And it's showing that Mary is a pauper. That's it.
You never see that word these days. And that basically means, I guess she was just completely impoverished,
Reliant on help.
reliant on help. She's got 5 mouths to feed, including my great-great-grandmother, Jessie.
So in 1851, Annie's great-great-grandmother, Jessie Fraser, then aged 3, was living with her mother Mary and 4 brothers and sisters. Mary's husband had died, leaving her a widow and a pauper. To try to find out more about Jessie and Mary, Annie is leaving Aberdeen and travelling to the coastal town of Banff, where the family lived.
Jessie was only 3 years old in the census. Her mother, Mary, my great-great-grandmother was looking after 5 children. Jessie was the youngest one, and marked as a pauper. I mean, how she survived at that point with her 5 children. And I think just what is so impactful is that I read in the census this word pauper, and I mean, that's not a word that anybody uses anymore. It's not used even when I go to developing countries. Nobody says we're going to meet some paupers. So what does it mean if you're a pauper? How poor do you have to be in order to get that label?
Annie has come to St Andrew's Episcopal Church in Banff to meet archivist Rory Wishart.
We've been looking into the background of my great-great-grandmother, Jessie Fraser, and we had a look at the census from 1851. The first thing that really struck me was that her mother, Mary Fraser, was described as a pauper.
Well, the term pauper means that she was in receipt of poor relief, which was really the the Victorian benefit system.
It's an early form of welfare state type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Victorian poor relief was based on the idea of the deserving and undeserving poor. It was set at the bare minimum so as not to encourage idleness. At the time, poor relief in Scotland was administered by local boards known as parochial boards. To qualify, a person had to be unable to work. It wasn't enough just to be unemployed. Mary Fraser was unable to work because she had 5 young children to look after, and her husband, a blacksmith, had died, leaving her with no means of support.
I would very much like to know when this blacksmith died.
Well, the burial register has actually survived.
This is the original
This is the original
book.
book.
Looks like an ordinary exercise
Jotter.
book. Yeah, jotter.
If you have a look here,
Charles Fraser, blacksmith, died here on the 25th of January, aged 38, of consumption. Consumption is really tuberculosis?
yeah.
Yeah. So the date here is 1851. That's the same year as the census was taken.
Yeah, that's right.
So he died just a couple of months before they took the census, okay.
Yeah. That really gives you an idea of the emotional state that Mary and the children would have been in, at the time of the census.
Right, because it's just a recent bereavement.
The conditions were tough for the family, and I'm afraid they actually got tougher. This is the old parish registers. It's a register of burials.
Oh no.
And it's burials
So-
in 1853.
Oh gosh. Mary Fraser, Banff. Oh dear me. She died as well.
She did.
She did.
Yeah.
Oh, how sad. That means that Jessie, at the age of 5, has lost her mother and father.
Yeah, the whole family are left,
Yeah. To
without
fend for
anyone to
themselves.
take care of
That's
them.
right.
Yeah.
Wow. What would have happened to the children?
Well, at this point, the parochial board would have stepped in. Their main concern was to try and keep the children out of the poorhouse, because it was more expensive to keep people in the
okay.
poorhouse. So they would have boarded them out with a family.
Is there any way that we can follow that through? Do we know?
We can. We've got the parochial board minutes for Banff. There is another entry about Jessie or Janet Fraser in 1858.
How old was she then?
She would have been 10.
10, okay.
And you can
Janet
see it in-
Fraser.
Yeah.
That's Jessie. There was red letters from Mrs. Cruikshank of Turriff. Turriff is only just a few miles away from
Yes, it's
you.
about 10, 15 miles away.
In reference to Janet Fraser, whereupon the meeting direct the inspector to write Mrs. Cruikshank to send back Janet Fraser when she has no further use for her. So, what does that mean? Sounds like she's been staying with someone called Mrs. Cruikshank.
So in effect, the board has sent Jessie to Mrs. Cruikshank in Turriff. But as to who Mrs. Cruikshank is, we really don't know.
Well-
It sounds like she's working for her.
Yes, she's working, but she's only 10. Okay, so by the age of 5, she was orphaned, and then between the age of 5 and 10, Mrs. Cruikshank has come in somewhere. Jessie must have been on her own, sent to Mrs. Cruikshank a few miles away from where she was brought up. So I'm just imagining she was just quite isolated.
Wasn't really much of a childhood for her.
No.
I mean, the phrase "no further use for her," I think, depersonalises it.
It's on the verge of sounding exploitative. It kind of is. If an adult has no more use for a child, it definitely means that she's been in some kind of working relationship, whatever that was. I just imagine her as a sort of scullery maid or something, this little tiny thing that...
I mean, it's a very, very curious entry. I mean, you know, other entries in this volume don't leave you with so many questions, whereas this one really, really does. There's no further reference to Janet. There's no mention of Mrs. Cruikshank again.
And who was Mrs. Cruikshank anyway? I think I'd like to go and remonstrate with her. Jessie started out with her mother and father and brothers and sisters as a little girl. She was probably, although they were poor, her father had a trade. He was a blacksmith. Her father died, and so did her mother. It's horrific for any child that loses one parent, let alone two, and all of a sudden going into the hands and control of adults that sound like very tough Victorians. I'd like to know about this woman Cruikshank, who sounds really mean.
Annie has come to the neighbouring parish of Macduff to meet Professor Marjorie Harper.
Hello, Marjorie.
Marjorie has evidence that may throw light on the orphan Jessie's fate. The trail begins a generation back with Jessie's mother Mary and the circumstances of her birth. The first clue lies in the record of Mary's baptism, which took place in this church in 1821.
So here's the baptismal record for Mary.
There she is, Mary, N.D. And what does N.D. mean?
Well, N.D. means natural daughter. It means that she was born illegitimately.
Ah, natural daughter. So, to James Rose Writer.
That means solicitor.
Oh, okay. So Mary's father was actually a solicitor, probably practising in Banff. Well, he's an established man, he's certainly not a pauper.
No.
And Mary's mother, her name is Anne Stewart.
Yeah.
I wonder what her background would have been.
Well, we do know a little bit about Anne Stewart's background, and it was a rather different background from James Rose's. It seems likely her father was a crofter.
Yes, well, I mean, if Anne was the daughter of a crofter, then she was very much lower class.
Yes, we simply don't know how they met.
Do we happen to know anything more about James Rose?
Yes, we do. We do know, for example, that he did not marry Anne Stewart. He, in fact, married somebody else.
Right.
And what we have in the next document is his marriage certificate.
Okay, so
Here we are.
Mr. James Rose and Miss Isabella Folder, December 15th, 1821. So
We go
his
back to the original.
illegitimate daughter, Mary, she was just a few months old.
Yes.
Yeah.
When he
'Cause
married somebody else.
Yes, okay.
So we
that
might-
was I guess no contact with the father.
We might speculate that at the time Mary was born, that James was already betrothed, engaged
Right.
to Miss Isabella Folder. So we don't know
Okay.
what Miss Isabella Folder would have
Okay.
made of these matters.
Solicitor James Rose had a relationship with Anne Stewart, which resulted in the birth of Mary. Shortly after, he married Miss Isabella Folder. Mary grew up in Banff and had 5 children, including Jessie. When the census was taken in 1851, Mary's husband had just died. She was recorded as a pauper. Marjorie is taking Annie to show her where Mary and her children lived.
We know from the 1851 census that the family was living in Carmelite Close, which would have been a close off Carmelite Street. This is the only close that's left. And so we'll go in here and have a
Right.
look at what it
Okay.
might have been like. As you can see, it's quite a confined little area.
Oh, wow, look at this. So this is where Mary and the children lived. You can just imagine kids barefoot, lots of them. women in shawls and heads, sort of headscarves and overcrowding.
It's very unlikely that they would have had a whole house. They would have had a room or a couple of rooms. And often rooms were subdivided, so you had families living in extremely close proximity. Certainly there would have been very little light in these closes, and within the houses, very, very dark.
So this census was taken on the night of the 30th of March, 1851. And this is where Mary was a widow and a pauper.
Yes.
And Jessie was just like a little tiny 3-year-old little thingy thing, bairnie.
And then on the very same night that the census was taken here and recorded Mary with her 5 children, the census also recorded James Rose, Mary's father, living in Banff with his very different family and living just really round the corner.
That's ridiculous. Around the corner. That's incredible. Are we going to go and see it?
We are indeed. So here we are, coming around just off Carmelite Street onto High Shore, and as you see from the census, we have 6 High Shore and the Rose family living here. So we're on the right street.
Okay.
So just really round the corner from Mary and her family. This is where James Rose would have had his house, probably, where this car park is, and would have had a good view out to sea. And here we have the census entry that shows who actually lived in the house at 6 High Shore. So you see James and his wife Isabella.
3 daughters.
Yes.
Jane, Georgina and Jemima Rose.
And we find that also living in the house, they have 2 servants. So James and his wife were living in very different circumstances.
They both have, and they have 2 servants.
Whereas Mary has 5 children and she's living as a pauper.
Yes.
It's quite strange, isn't it? It's really juxtaposed with each other.
That's unbelievable. His daughter and grandchildren lived absolutely just a few yards away around the corner in a complete sort of, probably like a hovel. And you wonder nowadays, like, how could that possibly be? James Rose passing his daughter and his grandchildren in the street. You wonder, did he acknowledge her? Did he acknowledge the children? Probably not, because, she has been registered as a pauper.
That's right.
He could have possibly, being such a wealthy man, ensured that his daughter maybe had a job or maybe even worked for him or whatever. But there's just that big divide. It's just that big denial of existence, clearly.
So there's a final twist to the story.
That
I think
I am curious.
Puts another piece into that jigsaw. These are baptismal certificates, and the first is for James Rose, born in
June the 10th, 1794.
And then we move on 2 years to another baptismal entry, same parents. So here we have February 1796.
Had a daughter.
Anne Rose. So we've had 2 baptismal certificates. We've had James Rose and his sister. And then we move on to the 19th century and to 1829 to a marriage register, and we find Anne Rose's marriage to John Cruikshank. Marriage in the parish of Turriff.
Okay. So, wait a second here. I'm making a connection. Anne Rose is James Rose's sister.
That's right.
She marries a man called Cruikshank, so she becomes Mrs. Cruikshank. Mrs. Cruikshank must be the woman that we heard about earlier who was taking care of Jessie, but she had no longer any use for her. So that means that Mrs. Cruikshank was Jessie's great aunt.
That's it. The dots are finally joined.
So there's our Mrs. Cruikshank.
So James Rose had a sister, Anne, who became Mrs. Cruikshank. It seems this is who Jessie Fraser was sent to live with at some point between the ages of 5 and 10.
So obviously, James Rose decided that Jessie should be taken in by his sister.
I think James Rose is the real enigma in the whole story. He didn't act when Mary, his daughter, was widowed. So why did he then act subsequently? It could be that the initiative came from his sister, Anne, who needed
she could
some sort of help,
exactly.
who had use for
That's
Jessie.
well, I need to have a servant. I know of an orphaned child, his grandchild. James Rose must have had a hand in all of that. But the feeling is not that he's doing it out of love or compassion. The feeling is that there's a child there that could be of benefit to Mrs. Cruikshank, because she says very clearly in the parochial records that Jessie is of no further use.
Jessie was seen very much as a commodity.
A
it would
commodity,
seem.
yes. There's no love there. Mrs. Cruikshank kicked her out, basically.
Yes.
So, I mean, if she had really cared for her, a child of 10, she would have, there's no way she would have kicked her out. It's
People living cheek by jowl, what is known, what is not known.
Yeah, in the middle of a very closed society. The whole thing is very dark. It's a very Victorian melodrama to me. This is, oh, what a complex web we weave. It tells you that it's acceptable for a man of a certain class to sire children out of wedlock, have his own life with his servants and with his own family, but the others are almost like mongrels, and it's fine. You don't have to have too much responsibility for them. And this little girl, Jessie, at no point do you feel that there's anyone really loving her, taking care of her at all. It's just rough.
Now Annie wants to find out if she can pick up the thread of Jessie's life from the age of 10.
I would like to find out what happened to Jessie after Mrs. Cruikshank had no further use of her. So we're going to look into the next census that was taken. That would have been in 1861. If we find her, she should be 13 years old. So her first name is Janet. I'm going to look for Banff. This is because she was going to be sent back to Banff by Mrs. Cruikshank. No matches. Okay. Little bit frustrating. What I think I might do is look for her in the town I know she went to ultimately, which is Aberdeen. Do the search. No matches. So maybe Janet starts to become Jessie by now. So I think I'm going to try that. Oh, 2 matches. Okay, so here's Jessie Fraser. She's come from Banff. 13. Yes, that's definitely her. It looks like Jessie is a boarder in a household on her own at 13 years old. Jessie, oh God, Jessie Fraser. I can't read this writing. Is it flax? Flax. Flax mill worker. The flax mill, actually, that I know of, was right across the street from where I was brought up. Broadford, yeah. She must have worked in there. Wow. Round the corner from where we lived. Ironically, bizarrely. That's quite amazing, actually. And my great-great-grandmother, Jessie Fraser, she was sent out from Mrs. Cruikshank's at the age of 10. And then this little girl, she's ended up 3 years later in Aberdeen on her own in this hardcore work in a factory. It's like a pillar-to-post existence. She's had a rotten life. A really terrible. Gosh. Oh.
Following in the footsteps of her great-great-grandmother Jessie, Annie has come back to Aberdeen.
For Jessie, this city must have been overwhelming. I mean, it's a big, dark, dangerous place. She's only little.
Annie's on her way to Broadford Mill, in the neighbourhood where she grew up.
I remember these walls when I was a little girl, as I lived here from the age of as I was a baby until I was about 8 years old, and I used to play with balls, you know, up against the wall, and it was very imposing. If I'd known that my great-great-grandmother as a teenager was working there in the Victorian times, It's almost like fiction.
Annie is being met by Dr. Alistair Dury.
Hi, Alistair.
Hello, Annie.
Good to meet you.
Welcome to Broadford Works. This is where Jessie would have come every day, 6 days a week. 150 odd years ago.
That's right.
I'm afraid you're going to need a hat
Okay.
before we go in, and we'll unlock the gates. Come away in.
Okay.
Girls did start in a mill like this at the age of 9. She was, what, perhaps 10?
I think she was about, well, that we know that she was working here when she was 13.
At 13, she would have been full-time here, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week.
Flax mills like Broadford were engaged in making linen thread and linen products from the plant flax. Linen was stronger and more durable than its competitor cotton, and Broadford specialised in the manufacture of linen canvas goods, like hose pipes and tarpaulin. In the early 1860s, when Jessie arrived here, business was booming.
She was a country girl. She came in from either Banff or Turf. What would have the contrast been like?
For a girl like her, coming into a mill would be a bit of a shock. Although it's deserted now, in its day this would have been a hive of noise and industry and dust. After all, the machinery is running full-time, the temperature goes up and down, the noise of the machines. But I suspect most people adjusted, and she will have done so.
Broadford was one of the biggest textile mills in Scotland, employing more than 2,000 hands, most of them women and young girls. With long hours, 6-day weeks and meagre pay, it was a grueling life.
This is where Jessie would have spent her working day, and she spent it in company with 60 to 100, maybe more girls, most of them teenage, 13 to 18, some younger, operating the spinning machines. The thing is, of course, when they got to 18, they were on full wages. And what often happened was that mill owners, should the girl decide to get married, used that as an opportunity to dismiss them and then engage a younger girl who would be cheaper.
Well, we know she did get married, actually, obviously, because my
Yes.
great-grandfather is her son.
Alistair has documents that will help Annie piece together Jessie's later life.
Here's the census for 1871.
Ah, this is the census that I saw earlier on
Right,
when I was in the
okay.
Aberdeen Library. Jessie is now 24. She's married to James Henderson, and they have a son of 4 years old, whose name is Charles. That is my great-grandfather, my grandmother's father.
You notice she's described merely as a wife.
Wife.
So she's obviously given up work. She's settled. She's part of a family, her family.
So it's a little bit brighter, hopefully.
It is indeed. 1881 is the next census.
Ah, fabulous. Right.
And the family has grown.
OK, so, the family has grown, hasn't it? 1, 2, 3. She's got 4 sons. Charles is 14 here.
I'm afraid 4 years later, 1885, this is not census, but this is
no.
a death certificate. Jessie's death certificate.
Oh, so there's Jessie Henderson.
Yeah.
Oh, dear me. Death, 22nd of November. Now, let me see if it says cause of death. Carcinoma, would that be?
Ulcerous.
Ulcerous carcinoma. And she was 35. She was just 35. Oh. Oh, how sad. Now I have some sense of Jessie and who she was. It's a life of tremendous hardship and very few opportunities. I'd like to think that her husband was kind to her, and I'd like to think that they had some kind of a better life. But it is pretty overshadowed with tragedy, really. When I first looked at this photograph, it was just this picture of a man. But now, as I look at him, knowing that he's Jessie's son, and I know her story, there's a whole different sort of connection as I look at him. And it's almost as if I'm feeling like they know I know. Maybe, there's a trace of his mother, Jessie, in his face. It's quite a dramatic story. It would have been lovely if my grandmother would be around to have that knowledge. But, you know, we'll take it forward, which is just really beautiful. It hasn't been lost, and that's really a lovely thing.
Now Annie wants to turn her attention to her mother's side of the family, to her maternal grandparents, William and Dora Ferguson.
My grandmother and grandfather, the Ferguson side, were country people. And my grandfather worked as a gamekeeper in various estates, and they actually met each other in Balmoral, in the royal estate there, where my grandmother was originally dairymaid. My grandfather died when I was about 9 years old, but he left a distinct impression on me. I have quite an attachment to him. I always have, since I was a kid, and anything I can find out about him would be really nice. There's a family story that my grandfather was probably illegitimate, but that's all we know about it. There's no further information. There are a few questions that would be interesting to piece together the answers, if there are any answers.
To start her search, Annie has come to her cousin Shirley's house to meet up with her mother's brother, her uncle Alistair, and his wife Biddy.
Hey,
Good to meet you. Come away in.
There was a photograph of my mother taken at Balmoral.
Grandma?
Oh.
Yes. And do you think it's at Balmoral?
That's at Balmoral.
And that's while she was working there?
Yes.
I haven't seen this picture. My goodness. Now, that is Granda. He's a young gamekeeper there, Granda, isn't he? Very dapper again.
Yes, indeed. Smartly turned out as usual.
So they met in Balmoral.
Aye.
Maybe, Mum, you could tell on the story about the Gillies ball at Balmoral, about Grandad.
Have you heard a story about it?
No.
Well, you maybe know that Grandad was a very good dancer. He could do the quadrilles and the lancers and, just fantastic. Anyway, he was such a good dancer that the night of the workers' ball, he was asked to dance with the Queen. Well, the Queen Mother.
You mean our current Queen's mother?
Yes. Oh. And Grandma, she wasn't invited. But I don't know if she was allowed to watch, or maybe she just sneaked a peep. But anyway, she saw Granda from the balcony dancing with the Queen. I think it was a waltz. But he was told which
Not
dance.
a tango.
Not a tango, nor a... What's this latest?
Zumba.
Zumba. That's the word I was trying to find.
Isn't that funny?
And she watched her fiancé.
Was she a bit miffed?
Oh, a wee bit.
She didn't laugh. Do you know how long Grandad was at Balmoral? How long he worked there for? No.
Well, maybe you could find that one out. It would be quite
really
interesting to know.
Yeah. We've got one more picture of Granda, and I love this one. I just think this is the sweetest.
I know.
And again, he's so well turned out there as well.
Even
so sweet.
I've always had this funny question about Granda because I was never really sure if he was born illegitimately. Was he? Is that the case?
No. The case.
Definitely not.
Definitely not.
So that means we can find out more about him then. Oh, fantastic. I was a bit confused when they said that my grandfather wasn't illegitimate because I'm sure that that kind of little family rumour had been going around for quite a few years. But apparently not, which is actually really good because I kind of like the idea that, you know, that there was some kind of solidity in his background. So now I'm going to Balmoral Castle, and that's an extraordinary thing to be doing. It would be very interesting to know when my grandfather went into service, and my grandmother too, specifically what they did. Wow. Oh my God, this scenery is to die for. It's truly amazing.
The Balmoral estate was purchased for Queen Victoria by Prince Albert in 1852. after she fell in love with the Scottish Highlands. From the early days, gillies and gamekeepers played a crucial role in the royal pastimes of hunting and fishing. Annie's grandfather, William Ferguson, worked on the estate in the early 1900s, when King George V was on the throne. Annie has an appointment with royal expert Charles Moseley.
So here we are in the great outdoors, where your grandfather would have roamed, up on the hills there.
That's right.
Where the snow's still lying, even in late April. He'd have been helping the gentry and the royals to stalk deer, and he'd have driven grouse, and he may have acted as a loader.
Does that mean that he loaded guns?
He was stuffing cartridges into a double-barrel shotgun to hand to the game bird shooter, let us call him George V, who was known for bringing down 4 or 5 birds before they'd hit the ground. He was so good, and that was an important part of being a gillie.
So it's all about hunting, shooting and fishing?
Real countryman's skills.
It was very strongly connected with the land.
Well, being a gillie, you were helping manage nature, really, keeping it in harmony.
In some ways, I think that they had a really excellent life, you know, my grandparents.
I think if you lived in this part of the world with its beautiful scenery, it was a very good place to identify with. And you dined off salmon much more frequently than the poor wretches down in the south did.
The first time I ever ate salmon was actually a fish that my grandfather had caught out of the River Spey. My grandmother grilled it for me. Under the grill with a little bit of butter, and it was the most extraordinary flavour, and I've never forgotten that. I don't think anything has ever matched it since.
Fresh caught salmon,
Yeah.
yes, delicious. There's nothing like it.
Gamekeepers like William Ferguson spent most of their time out on the estate, but they were invited into the castle itself for the staff balls.
This is the room where the Gillies Ball is held. Let's go over and have a look.
It's very splendid. According to family history, my grandfather danced in this ballroom, and one particular occasion, apparently he was a very good dancer, so he danced. He was invited to dance with our current Queen's mother. And my auntie told me that my grandmother wasn't invited to this ball, you see, but she was kind of sneaking a peek. But now that we've come in here, I have noticed that there's a balcony, and thinking there's no other place that she could have sneaked a peek from. So do you think it might have been there?
I think so. It's a very good vantage point, and if she kept her head down, as I'm sure a Gillie's girlfriend would have done, would have learnt how to do, then she would have been able to keep out of sight while she watched her quarry.
So I'm curious to know a little bit more about the specific dates when my grandparents were here, and you're holding in your hands some very authentic-looking records.
They come from the Royal Archives in Windsor, and that's your grandfather's employment record. William Ferguson, born in 1896, taken on in 1913, so he was 16 at the time. That's
And
your
here's my grandma's record.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Peyton Dora Jean, the dairy. So the date of commencement of service was the 22nd of January, 1924.
She was here until she left to get married,
Married.
which is in 1929. So she was probably on the premises, milking and churning her butter and catching the eye of William Ferguson for about 4 years.
Right.
So whatever courtship it was probably not a lightning one. Whatever his twinkling toes may have done on the dance floor, he was a more steady wooer, let's put it that way.
Yes, yes. Well, he was a modest person, you know. I don't imagine.
Great
him as
dancers
much-
often are. Great dancers often are.
Now Annie wants to look into her grandfather's family background.
I know nothing about my grandfather's parents. There was a question mark around this thing about illegitimacy that had been touched on, but I just don't know. This is his record of employment at Balmoral, and it marks his birth date. So now I'm going to try and find my grandfather's birth record. And the district is Braemar, because it's local to here, and let's find out what happens. So we found one match, which is very hopeful. Ah, William Ferguson. All right. Now, his father's George Ferguson, and his mother is Sophia Ferguson. It's so exciting. So the parents were married in 1895 on May the 24th. But wait a minute, my grandfather was born in 1895 in August, which means that Sophia was 6 months pregnant when they got married. Oh, okay. Perhaps the fact that my great-grandma was expecting a baby was probably fairly notable. And so this thing about illegitimacy, I mean, if she hadn't got married, my grandfather would have been born illegitimately a few months later. It might be where the rumour came from, but I have a feeling there's something else. I'd like to check out George Ferguson, my grandfather's father. Oh, gosh, look at this. My great-grandfather, George Ferguson's parents, were William Ferguson and Isabella McHardy. William Ferguson and Isabella McHardy had something child born on the 23rd of February, 1852 years. Name, George. What does that... Illegitimate child. That's what it says. Illegitimate. I couldn't... Is that what it says? Illegitimate child? It is. So, that's my grandfather's father was illegitimate. Ah, okay. Whew. They've skipped it. Not that it doesn't matter, but this thing about finding something illegitimate. So, and it's interesting that they've written the word illegitimate in the records, because I've never seen that before. Fascinating.
So it wasn't Annie's grandfather, William Ferguson, the royal gamekeeper, who was illegitimate. It was his father, George, born in 1852 to William Ferguson and Isabella McHardy. Annie's heading to the town of Braemar, where George was born, to see if she can discover anything further about him and his parents.
Right, just take a seat.
Archivist Pete Wadley has been doing some research for her.
You were interested in the history of George Ferguson, who's your great-grandfather. So let's start right at the beginning with his birth. What we have here are the records of the Kirk Session of Braemar.
What's a Kirk Session?
It's a meeting of a body who act like a court, and it's made up of the elders of the church, and they meet to discuss things that are going on in the local society. If you take a look here, we have Isabella McHardy appearing before the session.
Isabella, George's mother.
George's mother, it's your great-great-grandmother. She has been brought before the Kirk Session to be admonished for the sin of having a child out of wedlock.
Oh.
At this time, the Kirk was not just a place of worship. It also had the power to actively police the moral behaviour of the community. The elders who made up Kirk Sessions were leading members of the parish. Part of their remit was to investigate sexual transgressions, including illegitimate births. Proceedings began when the elders issued a summons to the mother, in this case Isabella McHardy, to force her to appear before them.
She would sit here at the front of the church. The Kirk Session would have gathered round a table. A minister would rise and would say, "You are accused as an unmarried woman of bringing forth a child." Well, now she would know these people. They're prominent members of her society. It's a small area. They would know her. And there is an embarrassment or a stigma or a shame to having to appear and apologise for her behaviour and then be censured and have the
It's
her
terrifying.
It's not a pleasant thing.
No.
But the church is responsible for the moral welfare of society, and this is the way they deal with it at the time.
Right. So, being interrogated, she declared that the father was William Ferguson, farm servant in the parish of Kettins.
Okay, the story is here is that Isabella, who's from Braemar, had left Braemar and gone to this other parish, Kettins. She had a job for 2 years as a domestic servant, and that's where she met William Ferguson, and she's come home to have the baby.
The Kirk Session didn't just summon the mothers of illegitimate children, they also pursued the fathers, to rebuke them and to seek financial support for the child. But in this case, there is no record that the Kirk managed to track down William Ferguson.
So now that makes me really interested in Isabella, because here's a single mother with a child. Do we have any knowledge about Isabella?
We know quite a lot about Isabella. We're very fortunate in that way. Isabella's quite interesting. She's back here again, in front of the Kirk Session.
Oh,
8 years later.
Oh,
What's
happened this time?
This is 1860. It's the same people. They met.
The same people.
And here, appearing before the meeting voluntarily.
Okay, so Isabel McCarty confessing herself guilty of a relapse in fornication. Being solemnly admonished to adhere strictly to truth, she declared that Thomas Russell, watchmaker, is the father of her pregnancy. She has another pregnancy.
She does. 8 years later,
Right.
with another man.
Another man,
In this case,
okay.
Thomas Russell.
He's a watchmaker. That guilt took place betwixt them in her mother's house at Tomintoul in this parish. That guilt took place betwixt them only once. God, they're into the
specific,
detail.
aren't they? Absolutely.
He had promised to marry her before guilt took place betwixt them.
It's equivalent of being engaged, if you like. He had said he was going to marry her, and then guilt takes place.
Right. Being asked if she had any writing from him of a promise of marriage, declared she had not, but that he told her uncle, George McCarty, and his wife. Being solemnly admonished, she was dismissed for the present.
She's pregnant by this man, Russell, now. But unlike Ferguson, what she's saying here is that he's promised to marry her. And not only has he done that, he's let it be known, and it lists some people, other members of your family, George McCarty, that he's going to marry her, and then he doesn't. What's quite interesting about this one is that she appeared voluntarily. Everybody would have known that she's pregnant again, and I think she wanted it formally recorded that this isn't her fault. She had promises
that were broken.
That it's Russell's fault.
Right. She met somebody, she'd had this tryst with him, he told everybody they're going to get married. So she's thinking, oh, great, I've got a future now. I've got a father for my other child.
She must have been very pleased with this promise of marriage.
Yeah.
But the marriage never took place.
It never took place.
This is Isabella's second child, Jane McCarty.
Oh, it's a girl.
And she's listed as
illegitimate.
What's really interesting is this bit here.
It's a cross.
That's her mark.
Oh, it says here, her mark.
Her mark. She can't write.
Ah.
So when the Kirk session said, do you have something in writing from Thomas Russell, what good would it have been to her? She can't read it.
Yes. So she's had 2 children, and both times she's been abandoned, as it were.
She has.
Isabella McCarty had 2 children, both illegitimate, and no husband to help her support either of them.
We know that Isabella came back to this Kirk session, to these same people, for a third time. Don't worry, it's not a third child. In this case, she comes back to ask for financial help. But she's not asking for financial help for herself. She comes back to ask if they will pay for George's education.
Oh, okay.
Now, that's quite interesting. She's illiterate herself.
That's
and
right.
she clearly doesn't want her son to have that difficulty.
Yes.
So she comes back to the church, despite the fact she's been sat here and been admonished twice by these people. She swallows her pride and she comes back and says, can you help educate my son? And they do.
Wow. George Ferguson, for school fees, I think it must be 7 shillings and 6pence.
That's correct.
So he's at school.
And we know that Isabella makes sure that her daughter also has an education.
Incredible. Education is a passport, in a way, to a better future.
I believe Isabella absolutely gets how important that is.
Yeah, because she hasn't had it herself.
No.
So do we know what happens to her next?
We know she never applies for Poor Fund. The Poor Fund records exist for Braemar. Her name never appears on it. But she's always managed to get just enough to keep going and to see her children educated and perhaps point them to a different, if not better, life.
Tomintoul seems to come up quite a bit here in the records.
It does, yeah. What it's referring to is a farm called Tomintoul,
Oh, I see.
which is in Braemar, and it's a vital place in this story. And we're coming up to Tomintoul. And to remind you, this is where your great-great-grandmother, Isabella, was born. It's where she retreated to when she fell pregnant with your great-grandfather, George. It's where that guilt took place with Russell, and where her second child was born. And it's where she lived a great deal of her life. But I think this is the original stone And a spectacular view over Braemar.
It's unbelievable. So they're looking directly over Braemar.
Yes, indeed. You can see the church.
Yeah. Pete, do we have any information about what happened to Isabella later on in life?
Yes, we do. If you look here, this is the 1881 census. Here she is, Isabel McCarty.
She seems to be on her own.
Yes.
Living here.
She's 51 and she's a poultry keeper. The 1891 census.
62 years old.
Yes, indeed. She's still a poultry maid, living on her own. So that's 1891. We go to the next census, 1901. She's now in her 70s.
And I've just stopped to think that if this census goes up to 1901,
yes,
and my grandfather was born in 1896, perhaps, he must have met his grandmother.
Yeah.
Maybe my grandfather came to this cottage to visit her, you know. And he was such a sweet-looking young boy and terribly nicely turned out. So I would imagine she would have been proud of him. And here she is, living alone, this little old lady, and poultry maid.
She's still working in her 70s.
Still hanging on in there.
And then finally, here's the 1911 census. She's now in her 80s.
Yeah. Isabella McCarty, living alone. She's aged 81, and she's a pensioner. Wow, I didn't know that they had the old age pension back in the day.
That's right, they do. The old age pension comes in Scotland in 1908. She's lived right into the modern era. It means she can stop being a poultry maid. She died in 1913, so she died when she was 83. The cause of death is given as senile dementia, but really what we're talking about is old age. She's lived in this harsh environment for 83 years, and her death is reported by her son, your great-grandfather, George.
It's quite a testimony to survival, isn't it, really?
Tough cookie.
Mm. It's a hard life, underscored by poverty. Isabella's life. And what is strong about her is that as a single person, she brought up her children. And then you see her life sort of scored by so many decades of living alone up here in the hills. It's funny, because I'm just thinking there's two kinds of poverty, rural poverty and urban poverty. And I'm wondering, you know, what is the better poverty? And I'm thinking neither, actually. Poverty is just ugly stuff at the end of the day. It's really tough.
But that's one of the most interesting things about Isabella McCarty. It's not what she did, it's what she did not do. She didn't pack her bags when she was young and go to the city. She stays right here. She's born here, and while hundreds of other of her contemporaries from Braemar and all parishes around here will have packed up and gone to the hill town of Dundee or the tenements of Glasgow, she stays on the land. And that's really quite interesting, because that kind of makes her part of the story of this land.
Mm. A continuum.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this really is home.
The lives that I've discovered on both sides of my family will definitely resonate with me forever, and there's no question about that. You take this knowledge with you, it doesn't go away once you know it. Now I have a sense of the Victorian times here in Scotland, and they were incredibly tough. And it ceases to be a fiction for me or an abstraction. It becomes far more clearly focused. The other feeling that I have is a tremendous sense of gratitude for anything that I have received from all the hard work that my ancestors put in. It's all about survival, you know, and I wouldn't be here without them and without their struggles. So there's this deep sort of sense of gratitude and a sense of, you know, understanding better why I feel so passionately about issues like poverty, really. It's been an incredible journey for me.